Here's a look at our nation's capital, a sunny day in Washington, D.C., yet lots of clouds over the swamp. President Biden will be promoting what he calls a success of the Inflation Reduction Act this week. Tomorrow, he'll head to Milwaukee to talk about Bidenomics for the anniversary of the Inflation Reduction Act. Then on Wednesday, Mr. Biden will be back in D.C. touting his economic plan. However, the American public remains unhappy with the state of the nation's economy. 51% say they think the economy is still in a downturn and getting worse. That's according to a brand new CNN poll. This consistent pessimism, coupled with a stagnant and negative approval rating for President Joe Biden, could be a warning about his attempt to sell voters on the success of his domestic agenda as a part of his 2024 re-election bid. Here with us now to discuss Bidenomics is Brandon Arnold, who is the Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union. Brandon, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I just wrote this down. I want to make sure I get this right. The whole Inflation Reduction Act and Bidenomics, is that a political shell game, basically?
It is. I mean, it's an attempt at gaslighting more than anything. He thinks that if he keeps saying these words, that Bidenomics is great, that the Inflation Reduction Act is working, that people will start to believe it. But as you just pointed out, Americans aren't that dumb. The polling numbers have been consistently showing that Americans aren't buying it. Americans know that their finances are not in great shape. Debt is higher than it's ever been in this country, both in terms of mortgage debt, in terms of credit card debt. That's very, very concerning. People aren't happy with the direction of the country right now. And no matter how many times Biden says the sun is shining, the birds are chirping, and there's rainbows in the background, we know that's not true.
You know, they often, and when I say they, it's the administration, they often try to kind of create this picture, this rosy picture. Oh, yeah, inflation was high last year, but it's now down significantly. While technically that's true, the reality for many people is that inflation is still prohibitive.
Inflation is still extremely high, and inflation is cumulative. So even as the rate of inflation starts to improve, things are still getting more expensive. They're just not getting more expensive as quickly as they were last year or previously. And so inflation is improving, and we should be happy about that. That's a positive thing. But we have to look at the causes of why that's happening, and certainly not Bidenomics. What's taking place here is the Fed is taking extraordinarily aggressive actions, the most aggressive actions when it comes to rate increases that we've seen in 40 years plus. That combined with improving supply chains were one of the big problems that we had, of course, during the pandemic. That is the reason why our inflation situation has begun to improve, not because of Bidenomics, which, if anything, has probably made things a bit worse.
To add to what you just said, many of the experts that I've read say that another big factor in the rising inflation in our current economic challenges, is the fact that our spending is just out of control.
There's no doubt about it. And it all started off with the American Rescue Plan Act that he passed right off the get-go. $2 trillion, all financed by borrowing. That is what caused inflation initially to skyrocket, again, along with the supply chain and a few other problems that we were having economically speaking. But that really turbocharged inflation, where we saw nearly double-digit inflation, unprecedented for most of our lifetimes. And then he came back with the Inflation Reduction Act, laughably named Inflation Reduction Act. It was supposed to reduce inflation by cutting the deficit, but we've seen more recent updates as to how much this massive program is going to cost, and it's actually going to increase deficits. It's going to add to our national debt. So if anything, again, this is going to make inflation worse, not better, all despite having a name that suggests it's something good for the economy. It's just ridiculous.
Is President Biden, and by extension Bidenomics, solely to blame, or are some Republicans complicit in helping with this overspending?
Well, most of these big pieces of legislation have been passed on a purely partisan basis. The Inflation Reduction Act, all Democrats supporting it. Now, I'm not letting Republicans off the hook by any stretch of the imagination, though, because historically, when you go back years, Republicans have played ball with Democrats when it comes to increasing spending. The traditional situation is Republicans want to spend more on defense. Democrats want to spend more on domestic programs like healthcare programs. So they reach an agreement by saying, we'll spend more on everything. That is one of the reasons why our nation's finances have been traditionally so badly mismanaged. Now, it's gotten a lot worse in recent years. They've used the pandemic as an excuse to turbocharge spending. We need to start turning that spigot off. We need to get our finances under control, but we got a long way to go.
Moments ago, you credited the Fed largely with reining in inflation in this country. What responsibility does Congress have, do you think, in also helping to try to rein in spending or at least get the economy back under control? And how would you rate the job Congress has done?
Yeah, I mean, the Fed has done most of the heavy lifting here. The problem with the Fed is that they really only have one tool in their arsenal when it comes to inflation. That is raising interest rates. Higher interest rates come at a cost. There's some benefits in terms of inflation, but there's some costs associated with that. And a lot of people are experiencing that right now. If you have a lot of credit card debt, if you have a variable rate mortgage, all of a sudden it becomes more difficult just to pay your bills. Your standard bills become more expensive. What Congress can do is help increase the supply of goods and services through things like good tax policy, encouraging companies to make investments in this country so we're manufacturing more stuff. If we're producing more stuff, that means the price of these things will fall. That is the better way to combat inflation. Things like lowering tariffs so our manufacturing sector can do better on the global stage, compete with our opponents and competitors across the globe. Those are things that Congress could be doing and should be doing, but they're not. So far, I would not give Congress a very good grade. They've mostly been sitting on their hands and squabbling over silly issues when Americans are out there suffering and having a tough time keeping their heads above water.
I appreciate your candor, Brandon. Thank you very much. Before I let you go, experts are kind of split on the idea that a recession might be coming next year. Some say it's going to likely happen, even if it's just a mild recession. Others seem to believe that we're safe. Your thoughts?
I think it's still quite possible that we're going to hit an inflation. I'd like to be an optimist here and say that we won't, but that doesn't mean I'm not worried about it. And again, I think the biggest problem that we have is consumer debt. If we start to see default rates really tick up, and they have trended upwards, but if they really start ticking up because people can't afford to pay their mortgage, their car payments, make those minimum payments on their credit card, that is what could potentially push us into recession territory. I'm really hopeful that's not the case, though.
As am I. Brandon, Arnold, we appreciate the time. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
All right, talk soon. Coming up after the break, the U.S. Postal Service reported a $1.7 billion with the B loss in the third quarter. The United States Postal Service delivers nearly 49% of all mail globally. We'll tell you more about just how it lost that much money after the break.